We are going to be recording today's session, so the recording for the webinar will be going out, and if you want to check it out later, you'll have access to that, and it'll get put up on the website as well. Jeremy, anything that I missed before I cover a few other items and then hop into the webinar?
No, you covered everything that I was concerned about for sure.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so a couple quick things I said I was going to show. As I always do at the start of every webinar, I want to point out the help site. Please check it out. So if you hover over the question mark at the top of your system there, then you are going to see access to the training site. And in the training site, where I recommend going is the FP library. And in the FP library, you're going to find all of the documents and videos and workflows and cheat sheets and everything that you could possibly want related by module, by function, organized by function, I should say. And it's really easy to scroll through and find what you're looking for. For
Sorry, Mark,
example,
I just lost the audio with you there. I'm not sure if anyone else is experiencing that, but I can't currently hear you.
okay, how is that? Are you able to hear me there?
Yeah, now you're back.
Okay. So, everyone that's on the call, I actually had someone earlier today let me know that I was having a bit of an audio issue. Now, I was quite convinced that it was on their side, and I did some testing before the webinar, and it seemed to be fine. But the fact that Jeremy just let me know that has me a little bit concerned, because it was kind of I was popping in and out there. So if that happens again, Jeremy, let me know, and I'm actually going to change my headset, maybe just pull it out and use the computer's audio input. So if we happen to need to stop for that for a minute to troubleshoot that audio issue, I do apologize in advance. Hopefully it's not going to cause us any problems moving forward. Jeremy, I still sound okay?
Yeah, right now you do.
Okay. All right. So related to the help site, you'll notice we find the QuickBooks Online integration, setup, mapping, syncing. So that's something that you want to check out. You'll also find that under the videos area as well. So if you scroll down, you're going to find all
Sorry,
training
Mark, we lost you again.
videos. Okay. Alrighty. So let's see here. I'm going to make a change. Jeremy, can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Jeremy, are you picking me up?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. So I might sound a little bit echoey. I popped my headset out. I'm hoping that it was the headset that's causing the issue. So hopefully we won't have that problem moving forward. Again, Jeremy, if we do, let me know. And there's one other third option I can think of that I can give a try for. So hopefully we're good moving forward. Okay, so we're cutting into our time here. So we're gonna move forward. Again, training area, check it out. One last thing I do want to show is under the question mark, there's an area called feature request. And this is allowing you to go in and put in any kind of feature request that you have. You do need to create a login to this. So you can log in and you can submit ideas into the function point feature request portal. You can track those ideas, and you'll typically receive a response from our product team on that. So I really recommend using that. We're doing more and more with it. If you watch previous webinar recordings, you'll hear me talk about the fact that we're trying to ramp that up and become more responsive and more interactive. And you're starting to see the first steps in our efforts to do so. So please check that out. Okay, so without further ado, let's hop in. So I know that a few people on the webinar today have not set up fp.Accountant at all. Some have. The first few minutes talking about that setup, we're going to run through it pretty quick. So if it's not applicable, just know that it's not going to take long to run through this. But the first step for setting up the desktop version is going to qb.functionpoint.com. So if you go to qb.functionpoint.com, you'll be able to download the desktop integration file. Now, when you select this, it's going to run you through a setup wizard. I did this with somebody live the other day. It only took a few minutes. It's going to run you through a setup wizard. It's going to run you through some initial processes to get fp.Accountant installed on your computer. I highly recommend you put it on your desktop just so that it's really easy for you to find. Once you have it installed and you open it up, really simple, it's a very light program. You're going to have a little program that looks like this. So this is fp.Accountant. Now there's a few things that you need to do right away in order to set up fp.Accountant. One is set up the FP credentials. This is step one. The FP credentials are the URL that you use to log in. So helium.functionpoint.com, helium.functionpoint.com. The company name, username, and password is the same information that you use to log into your FunctionPoint system. So just enter the exact same information that you use to log in and select save. Once you have set up the FP credentials, you then need to set up the QuickBooks file path in your FunctionPoint system. So if you have been set up to have the integration, so if that's part of your account, then in your Office preferences you'll have fp.Accountant version 2 as your accounting integration option, and you're going to find an area here called Integrate Accounting. Under Integrate Accounting, you're going to see an area called Set QuickBooks File Path. This is the file path for your QuickBooks company file. The QuickBooks company file is the location of the actual company file. Now that may or may not be the icon on your desktop. So if we look at my desktop, get some stuff out of here. So if we look at our desktop, you'll notice that I have QuickBooks Premier Accountant Edition 2015 sitting here on my desktop, but that may not be the actual company file location, the QuickBooks company file. The QuickBooks company file is what you need. A really easy way to get that file path is open up QuickBooks and then either hit F2 if you're on a Windows machine. Myself, I'm actually running Windows on a Mac, so I need to hit Function F2. You either hit F2 or Function F2, and it's going to open up this window, which is your product information. And here you're going to find the file path. So either F2 or Function F2, copy the file location, and then in your FunctionPoint system, paste it into the QB file location. Save that, and you're good to go. So those are very, very easy steps. You're putting in your FP credentials into fp.Accountant, you're setting the file path, and once you've done that, you then need to choose the option to full sync. And notice it says run only if requested by FP employee. And when you select this, it's actually going to double check and say, are you sure you want to do this? When you run the full sync, the system is going to run through every single bit of data you have in QuickBooks. The amount of information it brings into FunctionPoint is limited, and we're going to see that in just a second here. But it's going to go through a lot of data points and see if there's any corresponding information in your FunctionPoint system. Now what that means is that if you've been using QuickBooks for a couple of weeks, the whole full sync process could take 5 or 10 minutes or even less. The person I did with the other day, they were only using QuickBooks for a couple of months, and I think it took like 10 minutes. If you've been using QuickBooks for years and years and years and you have a lot of data in there, it could take literally hours to run that full sync because it needs to do a really comprehensive check of all the data points in the system. That's really important to know that when you run that full sync, you probably want to do it either at the end of the day or the start of the day when you know that you don't really need to be working with QuickBooks for at least a few hours. And you're going to see it doing its thing. And then once you've run the full sync, as long as you've set the file path and you've set the FP credentials, then you'll have the integration set up. And the next step is actually going through and mapping the data. And that's what we're going to take a look at next. And this is the juncture where QuickBooks Online and QuickBooks Desktop merge. So from here on out, up until the actual syncing of the invoices, which itself is also very similar, the two systems work in the exact same way. So the initial setup is a little bit different as far as the very, very first couple steps. But now when we're getting into the actual important part of the setup, it's all the same. Jeremy, before I get into the heart of that, any questions that I should be answering at this time? And also, has it been okay since I made that change?
It's been better. It has cut a couple times, but just for a few seconds there, not as long as the last delay. I do want to kind of touch base if you can pull up the FP Accountant just for 1 second here. I do want to touch base As long as the integration comebacks okay complete, you have nothing to worry about. I would not focus on the record of record. I have a lot of individuals say, for example, I only had 10 invoices, but it stopped saying 8 of 10. As long as it comes back okay complete, that is the main thing. If it doesn't count up all the records that you think it should, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not doing its thing. It just may not be processing all the tables that it needs to for that specific invoice.
Awesome, good point. I actually wasn't aware of that, so good to know. As long as it says OK complete, then you're OK and it's complete. So the next thing that we're going to look at here is in the admin section under Integrate Accounting, and we're going to look at Setup QuickBooks integration. Now this is the most important part of the integration, is the mapping of the data. Once you've run that full sync, or once you've initiated the connection between Function Point and QuickBooks Online, you're going to come to this area and you need to go through this information tab by tab and make sure that everything is set up correctly. So the first is general. And there's a few things here. You don't really want to touch it. You don't really need to be making any adjustments or changes here. You want to make sure that the expense mapping is set up to COGS/expense accounts, which it typically would do by default. You're also going to find a deposit item. Now that deposit item is going to be mapped to a deposit item in QuickBooks. Mine happens to be called client deposit. Yours might be called initial payment. It could be called liability. It's mapped to a deposit item that is mapped to a liability account for the purpose of deposit invoicing, where you're recognizing unearned revenue. And that is often going to map up on its own. If it doesn't, you'll typically only have one. And if you don't have anything, then it's probably not applicable to you. There's also an option to export service groups to classes, and we are going to talk about classes today. I'm going to talk about that in just a bit. But for the most part, this page should be all set up and good to go. You just click Save and move forward. Always click Save on each of these tabs. You'll then go into Accounts Receivable, and that will typically be automatically mapped to Accounts Receivable. And I've never really seen a case where you have more or it wasn't. So you just click Save and move on. Accounts Payable, map to Accounts Payable. Select Save and move on. We then have our services. And this is really, really important. Your function point internal services need to be mapped to QuickBooks income items. So your function point internal services are the list of services that either came default with the system, or more likely you've customized to be able to create invoices and expenses to your needs. So these are the list of items that you'll find available when you're creating estimates in the system. Now, in any case of a one-to-one match, so I have a service and function point called copywriting. I have a QuickBooks income item called copywriting. They are identical, and the mapping has mapped them up automatically. I have a service and function point called account service. I do not have a QuickBooks income item called account service. I have an income item called account services. Notice it's not exact match, therefore it didn't map it up. So I need to map that myself. Administrative, and I need to look at this and decide, okay, well, what do I have for administrative? To be honest, I don't really have anything. So I'm going to map that to account services as well. It doesn't matter the fact that multiple function point services are mapped to a single income item. Just know that when you create an invoice and function point that has administrative on it, it's going to come in with a description of administrative, but the income item itself will be account services. And then we just go through and select the most appropriate thing. So, digital, I'm going to put to design. Professional fees, project management, I'm going to put to account services. And then, that all looks pretty good. So everything else is mapped. I select Save. And then we can move forward. I might actually maybe unmap one of these. I'm thinking I'm going to do that. I'm going to unmap copywriting. Actually, you know what? We'll leave it. I'll show you what the ramifications would be if they weren't mapped in just a bit. But for now, we're going to leave them all mapped, because that really is what you should be doing. The next thing we're going to look at is the external expenses. Now, the external expenses are mapped to QuickBooks income items for the purpose of billing your client. and cost of goods sold accounts for the purpose of paying your vendor. Now, I just have a couple expenses in here. I know some agencies that I've worked with personally that have had hundreds and hundreds of expense items. And oftentimes they have hundreds and hundreds of COGS accounts, and they don't often match. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So going through this can be a little bit tedious, but it should be a one-time thing. You go through and you map your external expenses to the appropriate income item, and you map the external expenses to the appropriate cost of goods sold account. Now, I happen to only have one cost of goods sold. You also have, actually I have a couple, but you also have, well, in my case, I have a bunch of expense accounts. You typically want to put these to cost of goods sold as opposed to expense because you're billing your client for it. Now, anything that's going into function point is most often going to be client billable, or if it's maybe the client isn't going to pay for it, but they typically would, it should usually be a cost of goods sold. Now, I happen to have one cost of goods sold, and I'm just mapping everything to cost of goods sold. That may not be applicable. You may have a lot of cost of goods sold, and you're going to map each of your expense to the appropriate cost of goods sold. That's more common. I just happen to be putting it all to one in this case. And then last but not least, your internal expenses. These are typically items that you're taking inventory on and selling back to your client. And I just have a couple here, and I map them again to the appropriate income item. So that's really, really important part of the setup. We'll talk about service groups in just a second. Jeremy, any questions on any of this so far?
Yeah, I was just hoping you could touch base. We see the word income a lot in there. Now, I kind of want to touch base on the fact that it's not actually an income coming from your general ledger, from your chart of accounts. It's actually an item from your items list. So I was hoping, Mark, if you could just kind of quickly bring up your QuickBooks and just go into the lists. Let's close that. That's perfect. And go to lists and your items list. So this is where it's pulling the information from. It's not pulling it from your chart of accounts.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's not mapping the function point service to an account. It's mapping the service to an income item. So those income items are the items you would use to create an invoice in QuickBooks, and that's what the system will use to create an invoice in QuickBooks. And each of the items are also then mapped to account. So the function point service is mapped to a QuickBooks income item. The item is mapped to a QuickBooks account. So account services is mapped to fee income. Copywriting is mapped to copywriting. Design is mapped to design, and they just happen to match. If they didn't, then that's fine as well. But the point Jeremy is making is that you're looking at your item list for the income item, not your account. Okay. Taxes. So it is very, very important that you have your taxes set up and mapped correctly. So you're going to want to make sure that you have your function point taxes set up prior to running this integration process. And of course, you want them to be correct and accurate and named appropriately and things like that. It's very important that no taxes is mapped to a QB tax code called tax exempt, non-taxable, no taxes, something that is representing the fact that it's not taxable. So you need to have a tax code that is no tax. Furthermore, in the US version of QuickBooks, you're going to have two additional tabs here. And one of them is tax groups. You in your QuickBooks system, you also need to create a tax group that is no tax in the US version and map that to no taxes in function point. So, a good way to look at this is as you go through each tab, if you find anything that is either blank or telling you, select an item here, you have a problem. Everything needs to be mapped. And if you look at something and you say, okay, well, here it is in function point, and it's telling me select something or it's blank. Well, what is this? It'll tell you what it is. You then need to go into QuickBooks and create whatever you're missing and then run the sync again so that you can actually then go ahead and map that. So it's really important that no taxes is mapped to the no tax code and also the group in the American version. And then, of course, your payment terms and payment methods. Now, Jeremy, I remember a few months ago, there seemed to be a string of support issues that were coming in related to aging on, I think it was invoices, because there was an issue with the payment terms not being named correctly or not being mapped correctly or not being done correctly. Do you recall that, and do you want to make a comment on that?
Yes, definitely. So basically, even though you call a term net 30, you still have to go into QuickBooks into the net 30 item and actually fill in the days for the actual terms. Otherwise, it doesn't calculate for you. And so what was happening was people were creating net 15 with a discount of 2% or a net 45. And when they went to their customer statement and looked at the aging report, they all showed as if they weren't overdue, and that was due to the fact that the calculation wasn't being performed in QuickBooks because the actual days were missing. Now, I just wanted to quickly touch base on that, just in case anyone's trying to figure out where that is. Mark, would you be able to just go back to QuickBooks for a moment?
Yep.
If we go to lists, and then we're going to go to, I believe on this one, it's going to be under customer and vendor, actually, sorry, other names list, sorry. Actually, sorry, it was the right one the first time. Sorry, Mark. Perfect. And then there you'll see terms list. If we click on that, if we just go into that one by just double clicking on it, you'll notice there where it's got net due in. Most of the time, individuals just forget to fill that in. They go, all right, I need to create some terms. So let's go ahead and put in a terms description, but they don't actually go into the bottom of it, fill in the net due and the percentage of the discount if there is a discount paid within a certain amount of time. And therefore that kind of section right there drives the reporting. So if that's not filled in, everything's going to look like it's just currently open and it's not overdue.
Okay, good to know. Well, there we go. All right. So there's just really one other item that I wanted to touch on here, and that is the concept of classes. In QuickBooks, and actually, if you Google, if you Google search what is a class in QuickBooks, you actually find articles that talk about the fact that classes kind of almost don't really have a description of what they are. And I've seen them used in so many different ways. I've seen them used to represent different divisions within your own company. I've seen them used to represent different industries you work with. I've seen them used to represent different people that you work with at the agency. Or within the agency, different principals, there's 4 principals of the agency, and each of them owns different account groups, and they use the classes to separate those. It's kind of an open field that you can use to track whatever you want. And that is going to relate to function point correctly in some ways, and in some ways it's not. In function point, your service groups are mapping to your classes. What that means is that when you go ahead and add an estimate and you see your service groups here, agency services, digital services, outside costs, inside costs, non-billable time. I have a really classic, simple setup in this system. These are the classes if you should choose to have them mapping. Now, this is important because, if I'm talking to an agency and they say, yeah, we have classes, and the class, we use classes to represent different types of work that we do. So, for example, we have a web development class, and we have a print production class, and we have like an account service class or something like that. That's really easy to do because we just create service groups that represent those divisions, what those classes would be. If somebody says to me, okay, well, we use class to track industry type, and we work with 10 different industries, that's probably not going to work because you don't necessarily want to have service groups for each of your industry types. And if you do, that's fine, but you just need to realize that that's what it's mapping to. So, if you use service groups to track something that works with sorry, if you use classes in QuickBooks to map something that would make sense to exist as service groups, then you can have those mapping in the integration. And then really what that's about is just choosing to export service groups to map to classes. And once you do, you will find the service groups option pops in, and you can then go ahead and map, and you'll notice that it happens to be pretty close for me. I have digital, I have agency services, I have externals. So it'd be pretty close for me. It would work out. In this case, and you'll notice I didn't save it, so it grayed back out. But I'm going to leave this unselected. I'm not going to map the classes, but that's how the classes work. So sometimes that works with the way the agencies are using classes, and sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on how you've been using it. And I see different ways all the time. So just something to keep in mind. But the next thing that we're going to do is actually take a look at an invoice, and we're going to sync that invoice over. We're going to sync an expense over. In fact, we're going to do the expense first, and then we're going to do the invoice. Jeremy, I just want to check in any questions that we can answer, anything that we should talk about before we look at the actual syncing.
We just had one question that I was able to answer, and just for those that are listening in, it was asking if you can go back into the mapping section, and if you needed to add a new service, could you go back there and map it after? And the answer is yes. You can always go back to the mapping section. If you do add a new service into QuickBooks, however, you do need to run a sync so that it does populate in that drop down that Mark was showing.
Yeah, that's a good point. So any new service you add in function point is going to immediately exist in this list. So if you're looking at this list and you say, okay, well, I'm not finding something I need here, you can jump into your FP internal services and choose to add a new service. Really, really easy. If you need to have a new QuickBooks income item, then that's a different story. You would need to go into QuickBooks, create the income item, sync with function point, and then you'll have that available to be selected. All right, so let's jump into a job here. I have a job that I created. It's for a client called Trees Organic Coffee. It's a job called Coffee Sleeve Design. Really simple job. Let's take a quick look at its financial structure. I have agency services, and I have external expenses or outside costs. And for my outside costs, I have a printing expense. It's estimated at $600. We're going to mark it up to $720, and we have not purchased anything on this yet. We have not received an invoice from the vendor and actually purchased the printing. Let's say that we have, so we're going to put in the expense and we're going to sync it to QuickBooks. Now what you're putting in here is the vendor invoice. So when you receive an invoice from the vendor, you would enter that into function point in the method I'm about to show you. If you want to use function point to generate a purchase order, you would do the exact same thing I'm about to show you and then just use the system to generate the PO PDF. Either way, the way to get to the expense add screen is to either hover over expenses, hover over external, and select add expense. That's going to bring you to the expense add page. And I'm just going to open that in a new tab. You'll notice it's going to bring me to the expense add page. Everything is blank, and I just fill it in. Another option is if we happen to be looking at the job, which we are in this case, coffee sleeve design, here's our expense. Clicking on the plus icon here will add this specific external expense to this job. We're adding the actual, brings us to the exact same page. It just fills in the details for me. So I need to enter that manually. And then from here, we're just going to choose our supplier. So I'm working with a company called TRC Printing. I've received an invoice from them, and the reference number was, let's say, 9087. If you don't have the reference number because you don't have an invoice yet, and you're using this just as an expense, as a PO, then you, of course, you'd leave that blank, and you'd add in the reference number when you receive the invoice. We then have the memo description, and this must be less than 250 characters. Very important. This must be less than 250 characters in this memo description. It's a limitation between the connection to QuickBooks and how much space QuickBooks can have in the description field that this is going into. So if you're syncing this with QuickBooks, the memo description must be less than 250 characters. Quoted for PO controls the printout if we're going to produce one. We have our quantity and our rate. Let's say we're actually purchasing, let's say 600 items at $1 a piece. Don't ask me why, I'm just going to reverse it. We then have the description of the actual expense. We have our markup percentage, which is filled in automatically based on what was on the estimate. So the client, the expense type, the rate, all was factored in, or we adjusted it manually on the estimate, and we can either adjust it here or adjust the total override amount. We'll leave it as it is. Select save, and our expense has now been entered. Once you have entered an expense and you want to sync it, the first step is to select post expense. So we're on the expense details page, we post this expense. Posting something, so an invoice or an expense, is telling the system that this is then ready to go into QuickBooks. Now the actual sync itself, you're probably going to run it at the end of the day, maybe the end of the week. I recommend doing it as, any more than the end of the week is not enough. So you should be doing it daily or weekly. Daily's probably better, but end of the week is fine, totally fine. Once you have posted this expense, going into QuickBooks and fp.Accountant, so we'll open up QuickBooks here. Let's close down some windows. Let's open up our vendors. Here's TRC printing. Now there's two versions. I'm going to talk about why that is in just a second. But here are our vendor list. And what we're going to do is we're going to choose to synchronize with FP. Now there's only one posted item in the system, and that is the expense. So what we should see here is we should see TRC printing is going to jump up. There's another, what was it, $600. So there it is. So TRC printing just jumped from 500 to 1100. And if we go in here, then we can see, bill PO number 8, and then the invoice number from the vendor was 9087 for $600. And if we open it up, then we can see, this is the memo description. Notice the amount of space. Very, very limited amount of space there. Cannot be more than 250 characters. Really important. And then here's a description of the actual expense. So that's our expense in. It's synced over. It only took a couple seconds. If you do this daily or weekly and you have a whole bunch of items, maybe it takes 10 minutes. And that's probably a bit long. It would most likely take less than that. But the more items you have, of course, the more time it's going to take to sync over. But that's the process, and it's in there. Now I mentioned that I had two TRC printings. I have TRC printing and I have TRC printing _ vendor. I'm going to tell you why. In Function Point, every company, so if we were to navigate to that company's details page, every company is going to have a type. So this company's type is vendor. At the bottom, there is an optional field for the QB customer name or QB vendor name. Now, when I was doing this webinar in a previous occasion, I had the QB vendor name filled in as TRC _ printing. You might do that if you have a case where you have a company that is both a client and a vendor. They need to be going into QuickBooks as two different things, one for the client and one for the vendor. So you might fill in a QB vendor name to represent what they go into QuickBooks as when you are submitting an expense or syncing an expense. So that's why I have two. Not really something that you're going to come across, because you're most likely not going to fill something in here and then delete it later or blank it out as I've done. So that's why I have two in my case. But that's the process for syncing the expense. Jeremy, any questions on that before we take a look at the invoice?
I was just going to recommend maybe touching base on the reference number option. A lot of individuals kind of get concerned when they see the reference number coming in and they don't understand where the 8 or the 7 come from. So I was just kind of wanted to touch base on the fact that you can actually set up what you want the reference number to be. It can either be just the PO number that's automatically generated from Function Point, or it can be the actual invoice number, specifically just that reference number that was on the expense, or for safety reasons, we always recommend using PO plus reference number. And why I say for safety reasons, let's say you've been using QuickBooks for 10 years and you've got PO number, or let's say reference number 12345 for vendor ABC. Let's say they come in now in the function point, and they now have a new transaction, you have a new expense, a new bill in function point. You're syncing that over and you're using the same reference number. That reference number will overwrite with the current data into QuickBooks. So the transaction you had 5 years ago will now be transposed with the current data from function point. So it will try to update that record if the reference number is the same. So we always recommend using PO plus reference because of the chances of that, having that duplicated or having a transaction with that in it, and then using it again a second time around later down in the years is going to be slim to none.
Yeah, the PO number is an accumulating number, so it's just constantly growing. If you choose to just use the reference number, as Jeremy mentioned, you could receive an invoice from vendor A, and the invoice number is 100. 2 weeks later, you receive an invoice from vendor B, and the invoice number is 100. So you're going to have two reference numbers that are identical, and they're going to override each other. So if you use the PO plus the reference number, that is going to make that issue obsolete. It's going to make it moot. It's not going to be a problem. But that would explain why when you look in QuickBooks, you're going to see the PO number and then space the reference number. So if you're at PO 512, then you'd see 512 space 9087 would be the number that comes into QuickBooks. So if we take a look at the process of doing the invoice now, so if we go back to our job, we'll notice that we now have on the expense side of things, $600 estimated cost marked up to $720. $600 is the actual cost marked up to $720. It matches our estimate exactly. We have not invoiced for anything yet, so there's $720 outstanding. I'm going to, in this case, invoice for 50% of my services and 100% of my expense. And we're going to sync that over. So I'm going to do that by choosing to add a new invoice. And I'm just going to leave it as estimated because I need to do some custom stuff on the next page. So I'll add that invoice. So here's our invoice. Now it's filled in with 100% of the estimate of all values. What I want is I want 50% of my estimate, but in the case of the printing, I just want to invoice the full value of this expense. So I'm just going to select it, and it fills in with my full value of $720. So notice I'm invoicing 50% of my services and 100% of the expense that I've incurred. And we'll see that expense here because it exists. If timesheets existed on the services, then we would see the timesheets as well, but we haven't entered at any time. Therefore, the actuals are 0 for the timesheets. But we have this $720 expense on the job, so we're going to invoice that plus 50% of our creative services. So we'll save that. And then up at the top, just like before, we have a button that says Post Invoice. We select it. The invoice is now posted. And then in QuickBooks, when we run that sync with fp.Accountant, so if we look at our customers, we're going to see Trees Organic down at the bottom here. Here's our coffee sleeve design. The job exists because we submitted an expense and synced it into QuickBooks for that job. So the system created the job. Now, this is something that is new to people sometimes. Oftentimes I speak with agencies that, their interaction with QuickBooks in the past has been they have a company and they have invoices under that company. The way the function point works is you have a company, you have a job for that company, and then you have invoices underneath the job. So that's just important to note. Now in this case, there are no invoices for it, but we're going to choose to synchronize with FP, and we're going to see an invoice come in here for whatever that was. I think it was like $3,400 or something like that. says, so there we go. So coffee sleeve design, 3470. So I brought it in from function point. And just before we can hop in and we can see the details of this invoice. So notice that we have the item is account services. That is the QuickBooks item. The description is account service. That was the service and function point. I have a QuickBooks item here, again, account services. The service and function point was project management, but there was no income item for project management, so it's mapped to account services. So we're seeing account services twice because that's how we chose to map it. But the description shows what the service was if there happens to be any variation between your services and items. So, that's really the basics of syncing over the invoice. Really simple. Jeremy, anything that I should touch on related to that I didn't or missed, or any questions about that?
Do you want to touch base on the tax on the external expense? A question came in, it's a good question, is where do you enter the tax options for external expenses that require the client to pay tax?
Okay, so that is a good question. I mean, it might take a little bit to go through. We only have 10 minutes left, and I want to take a look at the QuickBooks Online thing, but let's I'm going to talk about it as briefly as I can. So when you add an expense, you're choosing what tax do you need to pay. So where you see this line here and you see yellow, this is all related to you and your vendor. It has nothing to do with your client. Absolutely nothing to do with your client. It's you and your vendor. So quantity 1, rate 100. Tax group, let's say GST, I think it's 5%. Yeah, it's 5%. Comes out to 105. Notice below in the blue is what your client is going to pay. The markup has not been filled in, it's 0 right now. So the client value is $100. It's not 105, it's 100. Because we're not passing the tax through. The tax on the purchase of the expense and the tax on charging the client for the expense are two completely separate things. And this is sometimes cause of confusion. Now, it's incredibly rare. I've actually never really seen it. But if for some reason you are going to pass this value of 105 onto your client, then you can do so using these options. I don't even want to show what they are because 99.99999% of the time, that's the incorrect thing to do. Sorry about that. I had a calendar reminders pop up. So this is the client billable value. But let's say that you need to charge the client tax on the expense. That is handled in a separate way. In the back end of the system, under service and expense management, every single, I don't know why that opened up in a different tab. Every single service and every single expense, open up a separate tab again. I must be accidentally right-clicking it with my pad, but anyway, this is fine. So every single service and every single expense needs to have taxes applied to it. So in my system, I have no taxes being applied to any expenses. If you need to charge your clients taxes on, let's say, your printing, then you need to choose what are the applicable taxes for this. Now, function point is really flexible when it comes to taxes, and you're going to be very hard pressed to find a situation it can't handle. But taxes can be extremely complex depending on your jurisdiction. You might live in an area where all the different counties have different taxes. So if you have 10 different counties that you might be having clients in, and you're billing all of them, and you have a list of taxes for all those counties, and they'd be applicable depending on, each one could potentially be applicable if you're doing work for that county. They all need to be selected. And that just means that when you are actually creating a job and you're creating an invoice and you select the tax group, if I have both PST and GST applied for this expense, then that means that when I go to add an invoice, If I choose my tax group of GST, well, it's going to work because printing has GST tagged to it, and it's going to have a value of 5%. If I choose PST, it's going to work because it has printing mapped to it, and it's going to have a value of 7%. If I choose GST and PST, it's going to use both. So, again, you're controlling the payment of taxes on the expense itself, as far as you paying taxes for the purchase from your vendor, and you're controlling the taxes that the client is paying you by applying those taxes to the expense item in the admin section and also to all of your services. I recommend that you very, very thoroughly review all the tax documentation in Function Point when setting up your taxes. Double check your jurisdictions, what is taxable, what is not, and do not move forward from that topic until you are 100% sure that all of your taxes are set up correctly. And once they are, you should really never need to worry about this ever again. And everything's just going to flow through perfectly fine. You can set default taxes at the client for each service, each expense type. It's all going to flow through automatically with very, very little manual interaction as long as you set it up correctly initially. So hope I did a good enough job in that really kind of condensed explanation of the taxes in the system. But we only have 6 minutes left, and I want to show the very, very slim difference between syncing with QuickBooks Online and QuickBooks for the desktop. It's almost identical to what we've been seeing so far. Very, very little difference, but I do want to show what that difference is. Jeremy, anything that you want me to mention before we hop into that for the last few minutes here?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so I'm going to log out of this system and log into the other one. I believe it was Jeremy QBO. Take the word demo out of there, and my login should work. There we go. Okay, so I have this is just a different system that's hooked up to a QuickBooks Online version instead of an installed. And I have QuickBooks Online open here, or at least I thought I did. Looks like it's kicked me out after a while. Get back in there. Okay, so here we have our QuickBooks Online, and then we have our Function Point system. So if we look at our job, now I have a job here called New Mug Design. Again, it's for Trees Organic Coffee. I'm just going to create an invoice for the full value, so $63.45. Really simple. I'm just going to add a new invoice. Add invoice. There's our invoice for $63.45. Notice the button does not say Post Invoice. It says Export Invoice. This is the only difference in the way that these integrations operate. They map the items exactly the same. They map the COGS counts exactly the same. It's all very, very similar. The difference is that instead of post, it says export. So when I choose to export this expense, it exports it over to QuickBooks Online. It's doing it one at a time. So you're not posting all these expenses and then syncing at the end of the day or the end of the week. You're exporting them as you create them or as you need to. So, if we come back in here and we look at our clients and we look at Trees Organic, and Jeremy, you might have to help me out in navigating around here. Hey, Jeremy, are you still there?
Yeah, sorry, I was having a little technical difficulty on my headphones here.
No problem. Very, very stupid question, but where can I find the invoice in QuickBooks Online?
Under where it says Your Books, sir, if you can just click on that for me.
Oh, of course, there we go. And then under Customers, and then if we go to Trees Organic Coffee, then here is our invoice $63.45 right here. So there's our invoice. And the expense works the exact same way. You create it, the mapping is identical. The items and the COGS accounts and all of that. The main difference is that you're choosing to export instead of post. And some people like that better. Some people don't like it as much. Some people want to have that posting routine and then sync them all at the same time. I think personally, I would prefer the online version and exporting each one as I create them. And then also, if you have, say, your account executives creating the invoices and you want to do a review before they get exported, then you just don't provide the ability for them to export the invoice. You don't provide the permission. And then all you do is you do an invoice find. And you do an invoice find for all the unposted invoices. I might not have any, we'll see. Yeah, so I do. So all the unposted invoices, you just choose to export, and you just review them, and you just hit export, export, export. This one has some mapping issues. The retainer item's not set. Export, export, and you just export them all. Say at the end of the day, if you want to. But myself, most likely, I would just be exporting them as I create them. Um, it's easier, it's instant, it's all done within the browser. Right in the other tab, you'll see that other invoice right away. Here it is right here. We just created it. We just synced it over. All the detail is right there. So, almost identical in the way that those two systems work, with that very slight difference at the end of just being able to instant export instead of posting and syncing. So, we only have a couple minutes left here, finishing right on time. I really appreciate everyone's time. I really hope that some of you will be able to join into our session on the 16th of December. And again, I'm going to send an invite out to all of you. Hopefully today, it might be early tomorrow that you'll receive that. But I'm going to send an invite out to that. So please do respond and let me know if you're joining. I have a few registrants already. We're looking for more, but again, space is limited. So let me know if you'd like to join in. Love to have you. I think we could probably have enough space for most of the people on the webinar today. So, we'll see if it fills up from that. And if it doesn't, then we'll reach out to a few other companies. But, it'll give you an opportunity to talk amongst agencies, talk amongst yourselves, ask me questions while you're mic'd up. And we'll be able to, go through more specific workflow scenarios, talk through different ways that, you might be getting your account managers into the mix or you're not, and how you work with your bookkeeper that comes in every day or every week on the Wednesday. What do they do? What's their role? What's the role of the creative director in reviewing these invoices before they sync over, and how do they do that, and what alerts need to go through for that process? So lots of really cool stuff. Please check it out if you can. Check your emails for an invite. It's going to come from me personally, so you'll see that in your inbox within 24 hours. Jeremy, any kind of closing comments or questions or anything that you want to mention as we sign off here today?
No, you covered everything I was wanting to make sure that was touched.
Awesome. Well, again, I really appreciate everyone's time today. Have yourself a very great Thanksgiving, and I will hopefully speak with y'all in the very near future. Take care. Bye now.